Hello. Welcome to this webinar series on how media and communication can respond to political polarization. Today we'll be discussing journalism in societies overrun by authoritarian populism. Professional journalism, arguably, is a fundamentally liberal enterprise. But what happens when the ground beneath journalists' feet shifts decisively in favor of authoritarianism and intolerance, and populist leaders persuade the public that liberal media are the enemy? This is a dilemma afflicting journalists in failing democracies in Asia, like the Philippines and India. It's, of course, been the story of the American press for around a decade. Our guest today has been studying this problem in another country that's been in the news, Israel. Now, there are, of course, so many questions and I'm sure members of our audience have about the media in relation to the ongoing war, but we only have an hour. So we're going to be focusing on dynamics that long predated the current conflict and that have to do with the relationship between the media and the Netanyahu regime. For this purpose, there's no better guide than Dr. Ayala Panievsky. Ayala received her PhD from Cambridge University last year and is now with the Department of Journalism at City University of London. She's both an outsider and an insider to the Israeli press. She used to work for the newspaper Haaretz. In fact, just a year ago in March 2023, Haaretz published an opinion column by Dr. Panievsky about the right-wing government's propaganda machine. Her article was titled, "How to Prepare the Israeli Public for the Lies to Come." This is a question, of course, equally applicable to a vast number of countries in the grip of state-sponsored disinformation. And this is just one of the ways, I think, in which the Israeli case might inform our understanding of problems elsewhere. So it's my great pleasure to invite Dr. Panievsky to speak to us.
Thanks so much, Arian. Thanks to everyone for coming. I'm very happy to talk about this timely topic today. I will share with you my screen. So hi, my name is Ayala. As Cherian mentioned, I'm a presidential fellow at the City University of London and affiliated researcher with the Department of Sociology at Cambridge University. And today, I will try to make a relatively short presentation on the challenge of journalism in polarized societies through the case of Israel, and then open it for conversation. So please prepare your questions and comments and feel free to post them in the chat. So what is on the agenda for today? First, we'll do some conceptual clarification. So what do we even talk about when we talk about polarization, right? To make sure we're on the same page. Next, we will talk about which challenges polarization poses specifically for journalism, because there is a long conversation about polarization and democracy, but we want to see what happens to journalism in polarized societies. And then I'll give you a few examples from previous research by me and colleagues and other researchers in the field on how journalists cope with populist media bashing in polarized societies. And finally, how to do better journalism in polarized societies based on the lessons and the research that we have from different contexts. So first, what do we talk about when we talk about polarization? And I will start by a few disclaimers, actually. I hope Cherian wouldn't mind, because the conversation about polarization, it has been so popular and full of different definitions. And I think it's important to remember that, first of all, of course, there are different types of polarization, right? We know in the literature there is ideological polarization, the distance between ideological positions, but there is also affective polarization, which is broadly the hostility towards people in your outgroup. And there is polarization among elites, there is polarization among people like you and me. And there are different types of polarizations, and they have different kinds of implications, both for democracy and for journalism. So just to open with that, moreover, We know that some degree of ideological polarization, for instance, so the distance between different positions, is essential for democratic choice, right? If we don't have, actually, just a few decades ago, there was this, there is a great book by Rosenfeld called The Polarizers, about how just a few decades ago, the problem was for many thinkers and researchers that there is not enough polarization in certain societies. We've seen how both in the UK, in the US, in other countries, parties from the left and from the right have become so close in terms of positions towards very crucial issues in public life that people didn't have a choice. When they came to vote, the parties were too similar. So there is some degree of polarization that is actually essential. And there are certain types of polarization that are associated with positive outcomes, like political participation, for instance. So polarization, we need to think which kinds of polarizations we are talking about when we're talking about polarization. And very importantly, Daniel Price and Sharon McGregor and others made the point that the discourse around polarization, the fact that we are defining the problem as polarization, might create a misleading impression of symmetry and encourage false equivalences. And this is a particularly important point when we discuss journalism, because the risk of portraying the problem as if there are two sides that are going in two different directions, and this is what causes the polarization, and this is the problem that we are facing as a society, it has implications, because it implies, for instance, that the solution should be bringing all sides back to the table. There is also an empirical problem here, because in many societies, we see how actually polarization is not symmetrical. And we see one party or one political camp drawing further and further to the right in most cases, and the other one, and the same is not happening on the other, necessarily on the other side of the aisle. So there is both an empirical problem and a problem of what are the implied solutions. And if we look at its historical context, for instance, in the United States, then we know that the Civil War, for instance, was an extremely polarizing issue, and these were extremely polarizing times, yet it had to be fought, and the problem wasn't polarization, right? It was worth fighting despite of polarization. Polarization wasn't the problem, it was, in this case, slavery. And finally, as someone who grew up in Israel, I want to warn us against one last risk in the discussion about polarization, which is that the polarization discourse can be hijacked to silence opposing voices. And I will give you, just as an example, I believe that one of the most dominant voices in Israel at the moment against polarization and division are actually Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who is a right-wing populist and one of the most divisive figures in the history of Israel. But he's using the discourse around polarization, and he's talking about how we need to counter polarization as a means to silence opposing voices and oppositions to his government. So we need to be cautious of this. We've seen this in many contexts by now. So after I've said all this and all the disclaimers, so why even talk about polarization in the context of journalism? So obviously, polarization transforms both journalism and audiences. In many countries around the world now, it changes the environment in which journalists are operating and their audiences are responding to them. So when we talk about polarization and democracy more broadly, research, there are many, of course, arguments between different scholars, but research links, there is evidence that links polarization, and particularly affective polarization, so the hostility towards political opponents, to democratic backsliding, to propaganda and misinformation, to declining support for democratic norms, harm to public health, diminishing willingness to hold politicians accountable, many issues that link polarization to detrimental implications for democracy more broadly. But in order to take a look at what it means for journalism specifically, I will now ask, which challenges does polarization pose for journalism? And I will use the case of Israel as a test case. Israel is, of course, in the news now for matters that are much worse than mere political polarization. But this is not unrelated. And we can discuss the link between the two phenomena in the Q&A if you would like. But for now, let's look at Israel as a test case for a polarized society. So Israel has always been a polarized, fragmented, divided society, but not always to the same extent. And we see that polarization has significantly increased in Israel during the last 15 years. You can perhaps see here the start of the recent rise in polarization. This is when Netanyahu wins the elections for the second time. And he's been in power more or less since then, apart from 1 year of another government. And affective polarization, so the emotional aspect, the hatred, the hostility, has risen by 180% since 2019, according to a paper that is just about to be published. So I hope I convinced you this is a polarized society, not that there is not that is a very controversial statement to make. But now I would like to look at this case and the research conducted in Israel in recent years to give 3 examples for the main challenges to journalists and journalism in polarized societies, and then to look at how journalists cope with it. So first, we have polarized public trust, the issue of trust in the media. Then we'll look at media hate, which has its own implications that are different. And finally, we look at polarized newsrooms. So when we look at the first challenge, first example for a challenge to journalism in polarized society, we see how public trust becomes increasingly polarized. And if initially, or at least 1 or 2 decades ago, we've seen concerns around lower trust in the media, then we see that in more and more societies, the problem is actually not a decline in public trust per se, but rather polarization of public trust. We've seen this in the United States, where the trust of Trump voters and MAGA voters in the mainstream media has declined so badly that although it actually increased among Democrats, in general, when you look at the average, the public trust in the media is declining, but if you look at the details, they matter. So it's not a decline, but rather a polarization of public trust in journalism. And then journalists have to face the question how to maintain the public trust and the attention from both sides of the aisle, and how to overcome this divide. And one quote from an interview I've done with a journalist in Israel a few years back, it really demonstrates this dilemma. He says, "It is mission impossible. I know that if I publish this story, I'll lose half of my viewers. And if I publish that story, I'll lose the other half." So you can really see how the changes to society are reflecting in journalists' dilemmas. And when you look at, this is of course not the same for all journalists, because trust building is different when it comes to polarization in different types of media. For partisan media, for instance, which is on the rise in many countries, the journalists and their audiences already share a lot. They share ideology, they share partisan identity. So journalists on partisan media, in a way, have better conditions to building trust with their audiences. We could say something similar about local media. We see that many scholars today are looking at local media as some kind of a solution or hope for better news in the future. Local media, local journalists share at least the location and the community, the broad community, with their audiences. But what about the media that tries to address everyone, that tries to talk to people on both sides of the aisle from different communities with different beliefs and different values? this is where the challenge of polarization is particularly heightened. And I think that it's important that we recognize that even if we had powerful local media and we had responsible partisan media, which is not what is currently happening in many countries, even if we had those, it is important to have a broader conversation or some media outlets where society discusses the future together. And we do need mainstream media or national media or public broadcasting or news outlets that target everyone as their audiences. And these are precisely these news outlets for which polarization is most complicated. Because the challenge for news in polarized societies is how to build non-partisan, broad, non-exclusionary links to your audience. And the second challenge actually goes beyond trust and credibility. And polarized societies are fertile grounds for media hate. We've seen the rise of populist media bashing in many countries, and we know that existing divides are being used and manipulated against the media, against democratic norms, and to further increase the same polarization. So the reason it's important to talk not only about trust and credibility, but also about hate, is that media hate has specific risks and consequences that are detrimental for democracy for different reasons. For instance, let's imagine a world where people don't trust the press, but they don't hate the press, they simply don't care. They don't trust journalists. We could talk about how to make journalists more credible. But what we see now in many societies is far worse than that. It is hate, it is visceral hate that leads to other risks of incitement and violence, bodily harm, hate speech, death threats, doxing, trolling, online and offline harassment. We've seen different kinds of outcomes for the rise in media hate. And we haven't been measuring or dedicating as much attention to media hate as much as we have to the issue of trust for many years, partially because we believed in this rational model of people trust journalists who tell them the truth, and if they made a mistake, they won't trust them anymore, etc. We know it's much more complicated, and there is a lot of research now about emotions in journalism. It's important that we dedicate more attention to media hate. And I will give you now an example from a survey. It is from a paper with that I've written with three brilliant co-authors, and it is about to be published in the next really 2 days or so. So I'm very excited about this. But we asked Israelis a very simple question. What do you think are the main threats of Israeli journalists? How do you imagine Israeli journalists? And among the answers we received were replies such as, they are funded by foreign agents and we should take down a state of Israel. Some are anti-Israeli, others are anti-Semitic, Israel-hating lefties, and they encourage all enemies of Israel, from murderous Arabs to Jewish-hating reformists. So as you can see, the problem is far greater than issues of credibility, of trust. These are very serious allegations. They don't come from nowhere, of course. This is part of the talking points of the populist right against the media in Israel. But the important thing is to see how much we miss when we only talk about trust and distrust, okay? So we miss this whole emotional turmoil. And for those of you who have done surveys before, you know how difficult it is to convince people to actually write down responses and long replies. Well, in this survey, we simply asked people an open-ended questions, and they literally wrote essays. They were so angry, they were so emotional about their hatred towards traitorous journalists, as they see them, that they wrote very long replies. And when we looked at who are the people who express most negative emotions towards journalists, it was clearly along the political divide. So the negative sentiments towards journalists was stronger in the right, and the positive and neutral emotions were stronger on the center left. Interestingly, again, going back to the question of symmetry, it wasn't symmetric. So it's not like the left and the center love the media and have very strong positive feelings towards the media. Not at all. But the political divide is clear. So the second challenge was media hate. The third challenge, which I think we should dedicate more attention to, is polarization in the newsroom. So how we sometimes think about journalism and the news industry as something that is distinct or distinguished from the broad society. There is polarization in society, and how do journalists cope with it? But in fact, journalism and the news industry are part of society, and when polarization increases in society, it does so in the newsroom as well. And it is challenging solidarity between journalists under attack in particularly difficult times. So I would suggest that we think about polarization also as an obstacle to professional solidarity, to solidarity among journalists under attack. We know that solidarity has been repeatedly mentioned by journalists in different countries as a determinant factor to their well-being and professional lives. And what I found in my research and dozens of interviews I've conducted with journalists under attack in Israel in recent years was that political polarization does not stop at the doorstep of the newsroom. And in fact, it makes it more difficult for journalists to collaborate. There are many other reasons that journalists won't collaborate with each other. I'm sure you can think of some yourself. We can talk about it more later. But this was definitely part of it. And I had journalists telling me, for instance, there is right-wing journalism that never discusses factual evidence in good faith, and we can't collaborate this way. So this quote touches both on the political divide, but also on the division of different professional ethos that were created in the right-wing media and the mainstream media. Another quote was, when editors-in-chief don't take the side of journalism, but rather the side of the media bashers, the forces that seek to undermine the trust in what we broadcast infiltrate our newsroom. So this was one of the reasons that journalists gave for what made it so difficult for them to collaborate in times where they desperately needed some collaboration and support. And I think it's worth thinking about as scholars. Now, how do journalists respond to populist media bashing in polarized societies? I will give you a few examples for that, and then I'll go to a few tips for the future based on research, and then I'll wrap it up, and I'm looking forward to having a discussion with you all. So, which coping strategies journalists came with? So I will mention three of those. Of the coping strategies I found among Israeli journalists under attack in an increasingly polarized society under populism in power. The first is strategic bias. So journalists intentionally leaned to the right, not just out of fear or because that's what they genuinely thought, but because they believe this was a strategic move to try and maintain the audience and the trust of the public. So for the journalists I spoke to, strategic bias and trying to shift slightly to the right or show some compassion to the right or criticize the left when they can was a way to convince their audience that they were not the left-wing traitors that the populist right was trying to portray them to be. So strategic bias was one of these, and I can give you one example of how it works. A quote from a senior editor who said, "It is obviously better for you as a journalist to be criticized by the left. They are considered traitors anyways." So you can see here how the combination of polarization, populist attacks on the press, and the delegitimization of political opposition shifts the conversation in a way that makes it better or easier for journalists to get criticism from the left than from the right. We can talk more about it. There is a lot to unravel here, but the strategic bias was one thing. Okay, so there was this constant shift to the right. The second thing was rituals of loyalty. What do I mean by that? Journalists were using patriotism to signal to their audience that they are not the traitors that they were accused of being. So they were, in many cases, in the Israeli case, the way to show that you are part of the national cause is to talk about your military service. There is mandatory military service in Israel, but of course we can think of different ways to demonstrate patriotism and nationalism in different contexts, right? This is very culture context based. So this was another strategy we saw, which is of course exclusionary towards many people in Israel who don't serve in the military, like Palestinians and others. But also it is a total surrender to the populist loyalty test. So to the assumption that criticizing the government or criticizing the right is necessarily treacherous or anti-patriotic. And we can see here one quote from a journalist who was talking about his colleagues' military service. So he was saying, Amnon Abramovich, who is a senior journalist in Israel, never took pride in his military past, but for us, bringing it up is part of defending him. After all, he's not some communist who sold secrets to the enemy before becoming a journalist. He's a real patriot, right? So you can see here the acceptance of quite a few presumptions of the populist right. One is that in order to be a real patriot, you need to serve in the military. This is the only way to be a patriot. And the second is that in order to be a good journalist, you need to be a patriot and you need to serve in the military. And that if you criticize, if you voice a critical voice towards the government, then you are suspect of being a communist who sells secrets to the enemy. So there is a series of assumptions here that are very, very dangerous for journalism, and basically accepting that journalists should prove themselves not as professionals and not in their professional criticism or reporting, but by, in this case, going to the military and fighting for the state. And the third coping strategy I would like to mention here is self-censorship. Of course, research found it in other countries as well. And in many cases, the self-censorship is explained by journalists as a way to prevent further media bashing. Needless to say, it's not working, but just to give one quote from a journalist I talked to a few years ago, who said, sorry, he's one of Netanyahu's greatest critics. And he said, there were stories that I didn't run. And if I hadn't been branded as Netanyahu's enemy, I would have. I had documentation of Netanyahu's bank accounts abroad, for instance, but I figured that if I publish it, it might seem petty. Netanyahu's fans would say, see, you're really going after him. So there is a lot of work here done to try and prove the populist wrong. And this is a very natural intuition, but it doesn't always lead to the hopeful outcomes, should I say. So I will just wrap up by giving a few examples for lessons we can take from how journalists in Israel cope with populist media bashing in a polarized society. And I'll start with the don'ts, because it's always easier than the do's. So I would say that based on the research we have and the evidence we have, surrendering to self-censorship is not just doing injustice to the people and doing bad journalism, it's also not working. So as far as we can see, after years of constant shift to the right, and self-censorship and strategic bias, the attacks against the media in Israel has not gone any lower. They are now accused of collaborating with Hamas at the moment. These attacks take different shapes at different times, but definitely hasn't solved the problem. So my tip would be, don't surrender to self-censorship. Don't amplify hate speech and division. Sometimes we see journalists, certainly not just in Israel, amplifying divisive figures, thinking that this would bring them ratings or traffic or whatever. We see years later how these figures gain power and turn against the media that built them. We can talk about it more in the examples. I don't want to make this talk longer than it already is. Don't fall for the balance trap. When reality is unbalanced, so should be reporting. Don't leave the profession or social media. There is accumulating evidence that the journalists who are most targeted by the populist right and who end up leaving the profession or quitting their social media accounts are mostly women, people of color, other religious minorities, ethnic minorities. This is not just a win for the populist right. It also takes us back in terms of diversifying newsrooms and working for equality in journalism. And don't take the nationalist bite. So when journalists were using their military background to say, oh, we are not the traitors that people say we are, it didn't stop the accusations, it didn't convince anyone, but it did have a detrimental effect for other journalists and their colleagues and solidarity among journalists. And if we go to the do's, so definitely we need to build new ways of belonging. Journalists, and especially those working for mainstream news outlets, public broadcasters, national media, need to find an identity that is not the polarizing identity that is used by the populist leaders, to build a connection with their audiences. We know that we have many identities. We are not just our political identities. We are parents, we are Londoners, we are sci-fi fans. We have a choice to make, and journalism is important in making the choice about which identities will be more salient than others. And we need to find the identities through which journalism can build links to their audiences. Insisting on professional solidarity, journalists still have a lot of power. They can use it and they should use it. Unionize, work together. You think that if you want to protect someone now, you will stay out of the business. No, this gets to everyone in the end. Think long-term, not short-term. This goes back to not amplifying populist, anti-democratic, divisive figures. It might give you ratings tomorrow. By the way, not sure there is enough evidence to establish this, but let's say tomorrow you'll get more ratings because you had Trump's rally, but you helped him gain power, and once he gets power, he will go after you for sure. So press freedom is on the line. Make sure you're making, even in the most self-serving sense as a news industry, this is not serving you. So long-term and not short-term, make the public case for journalism. One of the interesting things we saw when we asked people, Israeli people, just citizens, what they thought about journalists, they didn't mention democracy hardly ever. They talked endlessly about objectivity and bias and whatnot. They didn't mention democracy. The level of public awareness, education about journalism and its role in society is very concerning, and we definitely cannot trust governments to do it. So the media will have to do the case for journalism for themselves, and of course expose the polarizers and their motives and interests, because this polarization is not coming out of nowhere. I hope it wasn't too much. Thanks very much for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions or comments.
That was wonderful. Perhaps you could unshare your screen now.
Yes.
Great. Oh, that was great. I mean, at so many levels, I think your neat classification of coping strategies, strategic bias, rituals of loyalty, self-censorship strike me as sort of eminently transferable to perhaps every society in the world. You see it everywhere. Journalists trying to score political points with the skeptical public or intolerant politicians and so on. But what I really love about this research is that you're asking a very, very strong question that I think speaks to a genuine dilemma for good faith professional journalism. And the dilemma, of course, is that if you move with public opinion, perhaps because you've fallen into the trap of false equivalences that you described, you probably will end up betraying core democratic values. But if you resist, it's all too easy to slip into another trap of treating the supporters of populists as deplorables, right? Which then severely limits your ability to speak to the majority or to a significant part of the nation. Now, one possible way out of this conundrum, which I think some media are experimenting with, is to sidestep the most polarizing issues. And I think this is connected to your point about cultivating new ways of belonging, and perhaps to try to, rather than deal with the issues that nobody agrees on, can we gather public around common problems, often at the local or municipal level? And so you have movements like solutions journalism and so on. I'm wondering if there are journalists trying to do this in Israel, and that's I guess my first of about 3 questions that I have for you.
Yes, of course. So thanks for the question. I have a problem with this, and I'll explain what it is. So first of all, of course, finding new ways of belonging is difficult, and it's important to find the things that connect us and that we can share and we care about together. And there are things like that, and I think more things like that than we might think. But I would also be cautious because we see in Israel for many years the most important and crucial issue that Israelis and Palestinians should discuss is the occupation of the Palestinian territories and the Israeli control over the West Bank and Gaza. And for many years, there were attempts from the center, and this is basically how the left in Israel became center. There was an attempt to say, let's not talk about it. It's too divisive. And actually, there is a text from 2006 by Dov Waxman about that is titled "Polarization or Peace." And I think it is catching something because this intuition, there is something very liberal about it also, about the intuition not to talk about the divisive topics can be a big problem if the most crucial political issue in your country is very divisive, but it has to be faced, and it has to be, there must be a decision and a conflict and a conversation about it. And the attempt on the Israeli left to say, well, we all agree on what, more or less, right? We have a bigger majority on women's rights, and we have a bigger majority on LGBTQ rights. Let's just talk about that. Let's not talk about the Palestinian issue. It's too divisive. So I think it's important that even topics that are divisive, we must find a way to tackle them as a society. There is no way around it. Even if we agree on 80% of the things, but it is the 20% of the things that will determine the future of this place, we cannot abandon the sphere and let the extremists who keep talking about it and keep doing things on the ground to lead the conversation. And in many ways, this is what happened. So I think it is important not to scare away from difficult conversations, but to insist and find ways to conduct them. This is what I would say. And I think you do see this strategy among journalists, and there are journalists in Israel, especially women, by the way, but not only, who over the years chose not to talk about politics anymore, or the most kind of frightening issues. And in fact, the most dominant example for strategic bias that I encountered in my interviews was the occupation. Journalists stopped talking about the occupation because it was too much. It brought all the media bashing. It brought all the mob censorship. This is Sylvia Weisbord's term. So all the harassment online, etc. So I think we cannot, we don't have the privilege not to talk about not to have these difficult conversations, but we do have to find ways to make them in a way that acknowledges that we also share many of our identities. Perhaps not our ideological or partisan identities, but certainly other identities.
That's an excellent point, because so much depends on context, right? Because I guess the context in which this kind of sidestepping would work is where the polarizing issue, frankly, is kind of symbolic and it doesn't actually matter. So, for example, do we really need to agree who will go to heaven or hell? Christians, Muslims, Catholics, Protestants? Actually, we don't, right? And I think it is a perfectly good solution for society to say, well, let's leave the ultimate theological answers to God. And while we're sharing the planet, let's just sidestep our theological differences and focus on solving real world problems. But the context you're describing is very, very different, right? As you say, these divisions cannot be sidestepped without perpetuating grave injustice. And so, yeah, thanks for that wonderful clarification. My second question has to do with, I mean, you talked about collaborations. What about collaborations, journalistic collaborations between Israeli and Palestinian journalists? I have read about some of those. Are they still going on? Is this just the wrong time to pursue it? Is this something that can only be done when there isn't a hot war going on?
So thanks that's a very important question, and there is actually evidence of such collaboration in the past. So in the 80s, there is an article documenting how journalists, Israeli and Palestinian journalists, were helping each other mostly behind the scenes, not as much publicly, but collaborating on a daily basis with contacts and this sort of stuff. There is no collaboration. Okay, I wouldn't say anything too. There is collaboration, but it's very much in the margins. So news outlets that are very, very much on the left and are really working hard to collaborate with Palestinian journalists. The issue of Palestinian journalists at the moment during the war is also extremely problematic, because there were also all kinds of collaborations or at least allegations that journalists were perhaps taking part in violent actions that took place in October 7th. So the whole issue is very, very tense on both sides. But actually, the problem starts even before that, when since October 7th, the Palestinian citizens of Israel, so we are talking about people who have Israeli citizenship, who are part of the Israeli society, they don't live in Gaza, they don't live in the West Bank, they are Israeli citizens, even they disappeared from the screens of the mainstream media almost entirely. So the problem is immense, and it's not the strategic bias that has been going on for years, these attempts to appeal to Netanyahu's base. These things prevent any kind of meaningful representation for Palestinians, both in Israel and definitely in Gaza or the West Bank. I wanted to mention this during my talk, and of course I forgot because it's the most important thing, but for 3 months, while the whole world was watching the horrors, first in October 7th in southern Israel and then in Gaza, Israelis were not exposed almost at all to the human suffering in Gaza. So they were watching the news 24/7 because all the 3 big TV news outlets turned into 24/7 news outlets for months. And they discussed many important issues and have done a lot of important journalistic work. But the human suffering in Gaza was just entirely absent. And this is insane. Just because I am based in the UK now, when I went back to Israel, I found out that my family and friends are not aware of what's happening, are not fully aware of what's happening 1 hour drive away, and they are not seeing the visuals that all of us around the world are constantly watching. So there are a lot of questions there about what people want to see, what is journalism role in showing people things they don't necessarily want to see. But I think there is a long way to go even before you get to actual collaboration. I do think it's important for journalists to realize that this is the struggle against the raids and violence against Palestinian journalists end up like no one is safe. This is a slippery slope. It gets to everyone in the end. If not for any other reason, this is a good reason to collaborate. But I realize that collaborating right now is extremely difficult, and there are many things that could be done, including within Israeli society. So including the Palestinian citizens of Israel in the media and giving them a voice. They were victims of both societies at the moment. So I think there are many things you could do before reaching to this, making the most difficult step for an Israeli journalist who is being accused of being a traitor, which is to collaborate with his Palestinian counterpart at the moment.
Thanks so much. Well, let me turn to a couple of questions from the Q&A. One that is, I guess, related to the discussion we've just been having is from Shivanji about the role of independent media organizations. In a way, you've, I think, indirectly answered it by saying that, well, some of these things, the good stuff can happen on the margins, but how do you deal with the fact that the big TV channels that everyone's watching doesn't share those values, right? But the independent media must be part of must offer some hope, surely.
It's extremely important, and they bring important stories. Unfortunately, there is a limit to their power because they are very small, and you need resources to do good journalism. You need resources to overcome all the difficult conditions. It's not easy to make journalism in Israel and Gaza right now, and you need resources for that. So it's extremely important what they're doing, and the collaborations that are happening in the margins are important, and we get more knowledge out of it, because in the end, what we want is the public to know, but the public is not exposed to it enough. Even Haaretz newspaper, which I used to work for, and many times people around the world, it's a great newspaper, and people think it's the biggest news outlet in Israel. Actually, in Israel, very few people read Haaretz, but Haaretz is big enough to have an impact, even if people don't follow it, because it is big enough to get follow-ups. So there is a breaking story in Haaretz, and then you will see on TV follow-ups for the story. But this is not enough, and doing the important work that activists are now doing in the margins, if we won't find a way to push the mainstream media and the big news outlets in a better direction, it just won't be enough. It won't be enough, and it's also a drop in the ocean if you look at the efforts on the right, the settlers' right in particular, to take over media outlets and to dictate the conversation. This is just by no means, this is not a fair fight. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. This actually is a nice segue to a question from Jae Min Seong, who asks, beyond what individuals do, what about institutions and organizations? He refers to protecting journalists from harm. So I want to piggyback on that to ask you again about the organizational level, because you've referred to the disincentives to challenging the right in the form of criticism, harassment, or worse. But what about the incentives for, in fact, being friendly to the right, in particular, economic incentives? Can you say something about how the media have been captured by the right?
Yeah, so it has been, so it's important to note that this is not happening, this is not an accident. So for a few good decades, at least starting the 80s, early 80s, perhaps even 70s, the Jewish settlers movement in Israel, the populist right, has been trying to transform the media environment in Israel. And they have done so in many ways. And money is part of the story, but I must say it's not all the story. So for instance, the journalists I spoke to were all journalists under attack. They came from all the big news outlets in Israel. Some were public funded, others are commercial. The stories I heard from them were the same stories. So I think in certain contexts and certain countries, and I can see it when I talk to journalists and researchers in different countries, sometimes it seems like a different business model could save our problems. But actually, the ongoing campaign against the media to silence the media and to limit the boundaries of the conversation is very powerful, and different business models are not enough to solve the problem. We see a lot, I saw when I talked to journalists, and there is also research from Belgium about the right-wing bias that journalists have when they are asked to describe public opinion. So we've seen this in different countries in terms of politicians, but this is the first time I've seen a research on this in the context of journalists and how journalists perceive their audience to be more conservative and more right-wing than it actually is. I think that the bashing campaign is very successful. People are tired. People are, even the brave ones are, if you get every day poison to your very close friend, Mr. iPhone here, you will make your choices, even if you want to do the right thing, even if you want to take the fight. So perhaps every other day you will say what you really meant to say, but in 3 other cases you won't say what you had to say because you are exhausted and because you don't want death threats to your daughters today because, I don't know, it's their birthday. So what I'm saying is this percolates, this campaign is extremely effective. It's not all about the money. And there are many misperceptions about journalists and a very strong belief that if they just move slightly to the right, if they just do this, this will happen. That's how to win this war. And this is just not working. And this is perhaps my most important message for journalists elsewhere. We have an experience with this. This is not working. You might as well give it up.
Tell me, well, actually, let me. I have so many questions for you. I want to hog it, but I need to respect our audience as well. Davina has a good question that ends with this: beyond what journalists can do, what can citizens do to support brave and, I guess, counter-polarizing journalism?
This is so important. Thank you, Davina, for the question. And actually, this is going to be a big part of the book that I'm working on right now. When we asked journalists what kind of feedback they get, when I talk to journalists, I got the impression that the voice they hear, it comes mostly from the right. And this can explain this bias, this right-wing bias in journalist perceptions of the audience. The most vocal voices, when a journalist told me the people will say this and that, the people they were talking about were always Netanyahu supporters. That's the voice they had in their heads. And this is because, of course, they're very vocal. There is an infrastructure of both real users and fake users and bots and propaganda. We know this. We know that social media makes it very easy. I could really tell that the feedback that journalists are getting is a very specific kind of feedback and that there is no pushback against this feedback. And then we did something else with my with Professor Yariv Tzfati and Dr. Yossi David. We made a public opinion survey and we asked people, it's not published yet, so I'll just tell you because it's interesting. We asked people, have you ever contacted a journalist? And if so, have you done it in order to compliment them or to criticize them? And when you look at this and at the results, and you compare them to other demographics and voting patterns, etc., you see that the people who contact journalists are, this is the graph basically, are people from the right. And then you can see why people get, at least in Israel, and you can see why people get a distorted vision of who the people are and what the people want. So I think that for us to understand that this is the environment we currently operate in, it's a complicated environment, but we should all use our outlets, our contacts, our media, our social media accounts, our ability to contact journalists very easily, which is a resource that certain communities use very smartly and others use less. We should use it, and we must support journalists who are doing brave work, share their work. They need the traffic, they need the shares, they need our support. They need to know that people appreciate what they are doing. This is not at all obvious. And as I showed in the graph at the beginning of the presentation, you see that the right-wing voters in Israel have very strong negative emotions against journalists, but left-wing voters didn't have very strong positive kind of emotions towards journalists, although there are brave journalists and some of them are doing amazing work. So we need to communicate, we need to be able to support journalists, to organize, but in the end, the most important thing is to understand that just the way that each one of us has their stands on the economy, we have positions on in politics, all kinds of policy issue, immigration, where we stand on cultural issues. We have to have positions on media policy, and it has to become part of our fight, because no matter what we care about, whether it's climate change or immigration or anything else, if there is no substantial difference in how the media covers politics, then nothing would work. It just won't work. We have to change it, and we have to have policies on the ground, and we have to push our representatives to work. And I'll just give an example. Cherian, he wrote about the anti-press press, so the media that bashes the media. This cannot, we cannot just think that because this is in the hands of the market, this will be fine. It won't be fine. We have to come out with policies to make sure that these propaganda tools are no longer operating the way they do and are not using press freedom to hide behind it and to keep spreading hate and disinformation. So there is a lot that we could do as citizens, but the most important thing is on the personal level, see how we can support good journalism, pay for good journalism. It is worth the money. It is not obvious that the news outlets that we kind of trust right now will exist in 5 years. Even if you look at big news outlets like Haaretz and others, we don't know how the legislation is going to change, how the economic situation is going to change. Support journalism, try to contact and support journalists when they are doing good work, share their work, and make sure to make media activism part of your politics.
Wonderful. The tendency you identified, I guess for progressives, the people on the left, to I guess feel that they're too cool to support the media, right? Because it's a kind of inbuilt cynicism is extremely unhelpful, right? When you're dealing with strongly ideologically driven, highly mobilized opponents on the other side. This is not a time for indifference.
Definitely. And this is not to say, because we see in many countries, and it's actually a core feature of populism, that many times the anti-populist camp find itself defending all kinds of flawed institutions because they are under attack from the right. We've seen it now in Israel with the Supreme Court. There is a lot to say about the Supreme Court. There is a lot of criticism to express from the left, from the right, about how it's handled. But once it's under attack by the right, the left find itself compelled to protect all kinds of institutions that are perhaps flawed, that have historical sins, that are still making a terrible job on some things. And the same works with the media. So I don't want to say that we should protect news outlets or journalists that are not doing their jobs, but I do think that we need to be very fierce about how important it is for us to have better journalism and better news, and to support those who, against all the conditions we discussed this past hour or so, who are still fighting to do the right thing. So we should definitely protect them, not for their sake and not because they don't make mistakes, but because we need good journalism. So this is a complicated position to be in. You don't want to, nobody wants to defend the media.
Right.
But
Yeah,
we
and I
should
think, I
definitely
guess,
ask.
and yeah, what you're suggesting requires that citizens have a clearer understanding of what needs to be defended. It's not journalism as such, but certain kinds of journalism that fulfill a public service. And if we don't have that clarity, it's going to be hard to know what to defend, what to and what to, you may end up defending things that are actually don't need to be defended, right?
100%.
Or
I think
not
part of the problem
standing
is
up.
that we need more clear about what is and isn't journalism, and what we defend and don't defend in their name, but not to give up on the mainstream platforms. That's
Right.
one of the important lessons I think we can take for
Yeah.
progressive.
We're about ending, about run out of time, but I just want to, because you have done comparative work as well, including in collaboration with other scholars, can I ask you to end with an observation about where Israel fits into the larger scheme of things? For example, you have a great paper on Israel, Turkey, and India. Yeah. In what ways is Israel typical of other authoritarian populist systems? In what way is it importantly unique?
Right. So, yes, I have a paper on anti-democratic populism in power, written with Julius Rogenhofer, that compares Netanyahu's Israel with Modi's India and Erdogan's Turkey. Now, I should say these three countries are definitely on a different place on the authoritarian spectrum. But I do think, and I make this point in my dissertation as well, and it's one of the reasons that it was important for us to compare these three countries. I think that when we look at the world as democracies and non-democracies, this is sometimes you have to, because you have to make generalizations, but it's not very helpful for a few reasons. Because Israel is, in many kind of, you could look at certain aspects and say, yeah, of course it's a democracy, but you look at the occupation of millions of Palestinians and you're saying this is nothing like a democracy. So I think it's important to remember that democracy is a spectrum, and to look at countries on a democratic spectrum. And the reason it's important is that this spectrum is also dynamic. Israel was not where it is now a few decades ago, and even a few years ago. Countries shift on the democratic spectrum, and it can happen faster than we think. And for me, it's important that we compare countries that are not necessarily, comparing just democracies to one another, and comparing Israel to other OECD countries and Turkey to I don't know, China. It's important to see the links, and how, because if we want to better understand how democratic backsliding happens, and even more important, if someone manages to come back from democratic backsliding, how this happens. So in order to understand these dynamics, we need to see it as a spectrum, and not focus on the labels of, is it flawed democracy, half flawed democracy, semi-flawed democracy. It is changing. Of course, for me, as long as people don't have a right to vote, it's very difficult to call Israel a democracy. But it is true that if you are looking at the daily lives within the acknowledged borders of Israel, then a lot of it looks and feels like a democracy. So studying it as something else would be also empirically problematic. So I am trying to promote this democracy as a spectrum approach. I always bring the US as an example for, it's really, is it the exemplary democracy that we have around, or where would you put it on the spectrum? It's complicated, it's dynamic. And I think it's useful to look at it as a spectrum and to acknowledge that we are on different points on the spectrum, but this doesn't guarantee anything, and that even the safest democracies can find themselves backsliding pretty quickly.
Thanks so much. I wish I could continue with the conversation, but we don't want to
We can do
test
it. We just
your
have to
patience.
let everyone leave.
That's right.
Thanks so much, Arian.
Thank you to the audience, but especially to Dr. Ayala Panievsky for sharing your absolutely important and interesting research with us. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone.